they have at least 200 years of domination. And Indonesia, for example, in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, they also were colonized for a long time, and things were imposed upon them. And there were basically 2 or 3 responses, political responses. One was embracing Western liberalism and throwing it in the face of the colonizer, saying, well, this is what you say you believe, but you don't really act that way. And when that didn't really take them very far, then many of them had national liberation struggles of various sorts. They took basically two forms. One was a kind of Gandhian form of national liberation struggle. The other one was more armed national liberation struggle. And some of them then, since the 1920s, were also connected with the Third International, Communist International idea of national liberation as the first stage towards socialism. But all 3 responses seem to have failed. And that has created a new kind of Islam, a political Islam, which has very deep contradictions within itself, I think, and which we need to understand more carefully. But the other Islam that has existed mixed up with all kinds of indigenous mystical roots and practices in just about everywhere when Islam traveled abroad and converted new people. That is a deep reservoir of collective memory, of practices that are on the whole very peaceful, and they hope, I think, they hold for us great redemptive hope, except that that part is dominated by other socio-economic structures of domination, economic, political, ideological, you name it, cultural. So there is this deep cleavage, I think, not just in Islamic societies, but in just about every society, but every dominated society coming out of the history of colonialism and being still in the history of what many people would call neocolonialism. So that part has to be really acknowledged. And all the really attractive principles of liberal democracy, and they are actually very attractive principles of liberty, tolerance, have to be interrogated again in the light of social and economic equality, in terms of how to build a truly productive culture of equality. And in that, I think this other Islam can play a big role. In fact, I don't see how these societies can do without it, because that is so much a part of people's lives still, and they're genuine social practices. I don't really know if we are really making progress. I think it is a question of case-by-case study. I know my colleague Nader thinks that Turkey and Indonesia are making progress, that India has an idea of secularism, like the idea of Pancasila in Indonesia. That is not perfect, but it works actually much better than many of the other ideas in the political and social sphere. But I think it's a huge topic and very important topic for us to be thinking about. Let's see, in the back, and then David.
Okay, well, this is fascinating. I think it's frustrating to get lost with, well, how do you define who measures progress? Who states the metrics? But it seems hard to avoid going to some fundamental issues like what's the status of human rights in this country or society or any place. Is it improving or regressing? It seems fairly measurable and maybe indicative of the higher spiritual thought going on in society.
Well, I measure a lot of things, but so I suppose I don't have a knee-jerk opposition to measurement. I'm teaching a course in political economy of human rights, and one thing we talk about is how to measure human rights. And but it is it is fraught with many difficulties. And it can be used for many different political purposes. Human rights is a fine thing, and I do very strongly believe in human rights, otherwise I wouldn't be teaching courses in it. But it can also be used as something you can hit someone you don't like over the head with, and quite often it is done. It can also be used very naively to deceive people for interventions in other places about which people do not know very much. And probably don't even care very much, and who would probably be better left alone. So I think we have to keep in mind how fraught with dangers these things may be. I teach my students always to look very carefully at numbers and to learn how to do proper statistical analysis and ask the sort of questions, skeptical questions, that are methodologically necessary. But of course, you can't remain a skeptic all your life. You have to decide in real life as well as in your intellectual life. I gave a talk about skepticism that was at the end anti-skeptical talk. So I haven't changed my position on that. But human rights is an area that is especially fraught with danger, I think. And David?
You ended your remarks with your own poem, and then the words used to welcome you to speak was a reference to Rilke.
Yes, yes.
But the question I have is, what might theology learn from poetry relative to what Heidegger suggests is a role for theology to assist religion not to be mute in the public square, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does make sense, yeah.
Those are the pieces. If you could comment on poetry then, relative to the topic of this series, religion and violence.
Well, I think, the best parts of religious texts are very poetic. That's what has always moved me. Bhagavad Gita, which literally means Song of the Lord. The Quran, if you listen to it in Arabic, is a very moving, poetic expression. The Bible, the best parts of the Bible, especially the New Testament, are very, very poetic, and the Old Testament too. There are many really moving poetic parts. When Heidegger was talking about these things, he had several things in mind, I think. One is that he actually didn't want to use the word philosophy. He talked about thinking. What is thinking is one of his very important essays, I think. He also felt that art was very important, and he argued not just for poetry, but also for other artistic expressions. And although he, I think, made a very deep critique of what he called ontotheology, he wanted us to be able to ask those questions publicly and debate them publicly. The danger, of course, that liberals see with Heidegger's thinking is that what do you then admit into political discourse, and how do you really handle it? I think as a principle, a liberal really has to admit all kinds of discussion in the public sphere, but the separation is of church, or what I might call institutionalized religion, and institutionalized politics as a principle is something that also needs to be defended. But I do not see a deep contradiction between the two.
I wanted to get back to the somewhat to the beginning of the idea of fetishism here, and the notion of value. We originally fetishized money, but how we also, it seems, in my own work that I'm working on right now, we fetishize certain concepts and even certain ways of arriving at truth. The notion of reason is even seeming to be a certain sort of fetish.
It can be, yes.
Both in a way that helps, but also in a way that hinders.
Yes,
I'm wondering
yes.
if our ways of understanding the world being fetishized also play a role in this spirituality religious distinction.
Yes, I think that's a very important point you're making there. Especially what people have called instrumental reason. How to think about the means to maximize something. Neoclassical economics is a good example of this. You never ask, where values really come from in the ethical sense. You never ask how it is that you determine what is good, let alone common good. But you are offering people very good ways of maximizing something that you think is good. So it's a completely instrumental way of reasoning. And it is very logical. It is rigorous even. Maybe that's the only rigor that a neoclassical economist would admit to. And he or she wants everyone else to be bound by that. But there are other types of reasons too. When you're thinking in broader, even consequentialist terms, and not just utilitarian terms, you are using reason. And certainly when you're using reason to think deontologically, as Kant does, thinking about rights, thinking about duties, trying to decide what are the principles that make the most sense for our kind of beings, you are using reason, but a very different one from instrumental reason. So I would make that distinction. But even the pure reason, as Kant calls it, runs into difficulties. You cannot really ask certain very deep questions, deep existential questions about human beings, about death, for example, about what the nature of reality really is. Kant actually explicitly denies that you can know the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, by reason, which doesn't mean that you cannot know it by other means. This is where I think people misunderstand Kant. But we do have to be very careful about drawing the limits of reason. We shouldn't draw it too soon, but we shouldn't really claim illegitimately that reason can solve everything for us. Well, thank you.